Hello there! In Acts chapter 8, the Apostle Philip tells the good news of Jesus Christ to an Ethiopian eunuch. The man joyfully accepted baptism from Philip and brought his new faith back to the Ethiopian court. He thereby began the legacy of African Christianity that continues to this day, a vibrant and growing family of faith with ancient roots and fascinating history. Although the Bible does not name this man, tradition gives his name as Simeon Bakos. Join us as we explore the world of ancient African Christianity that he originated. Join us as we follow along in Simeon's wake. Episode 10. Tyrants, Traitors, and Tumult. Africa in 200 AD. We have reached a very exciting moment in the history of Christianity. We have reached the moment when we actually kind of have a history of Christianity. I don't mean, of course, that there has been no history to cover. There has been. I mean, what do you think we've been doing for the last 10 months? But you have probably noticed that the history we have covered so far has a lot of vibes. What did the early church teach? I don't know, man. I mean, maybe this? Did the so-called Gnostics emerge alongside with or later than the other churches? Your guess is as good as mine. What did Mark do in Africa? Beats me. Here's what the tradition says. In other words, for the first 200 years of its existence, Christianity simply did not leave us enough evidence to really know what was going on. We have hints, fragments, glimpses of an emerging African church, but there is precious little we can actually pin down. And what we can pin down is often the fact that early Christians did things differently. This is one of the reasons why modern Christian denominations can argue that they're following the customs of the early church, because no matter what your model is, you can find evidence to support it. Are your churches governed by bishops who have broad authority to decide what happens and what doesn't? Well, there's evidence for that model. Or are you governed by a council of elders who work together to decide what happens? You can make a case for that in the early church as well. Are you a more democratic church in which every adult member has a share in governance? Well, you too can argue that was a custom of the primitive church. We are starting to leave that world behind. For we have at long last reached the year 200 AD. And by 200 AD, we start to see more numerous and coherent written sources emerging. Now make no mistake, there will still be a lot of I don't knows and we can't say for sures. But starting in the year 200, it is a bit easier to tell a coherent story of what was going on in African Christianity. We know more about how many Christians there were, where they were, and how they lived and worshipped. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to set the stage for the developments to come. Let's learn how the forefathers of the faith lived. Come back with me on a journey to meet the Christians of 200 AD. First and foremost, the Christians of 200 AD were ruled by a dynasty of emperors who hailed from Africa's shores. In the year 198, Septimus Severus finally managed to seize power from a bunch of rivals and claim the full mantle of the imperial purple. He had the very good manners to do this right before the start of a new century, which means we can start the year 200 off with a nice, clean, new dynasty. Forget new year, new me. This is new century, new dynasty. That was a terrible joke. I will not apologize. Septimus Severus also has the distinction of being one of the few Roman emperors to hail from the continent of Africa. He was born in modern-day Libya, which was the province of North Africa at the time. His ancestry included Roman immigrants who intermarried with Berber and Punic locals. This has led to some scholars describing Septimus Severus as black. Now, the claim of blackness is a difficult one to assess, in part because Romans didn't think of people as being black or white. Remember that in ancient Rome, your race was not your skin color, it was where you were from. Some of Septimus's contemporaries describe him as Libyan by race, which does indeed suggest that today we probably wouldn't have considered him white. However, we also don't know how much melanin Septimus had in his skin. The ancients probably did. There were all kinds of sculptures of his face that would have been brightly painted. Unfortunately, paint doesn't survive 800 years, so his skin color is unknown to us. By the way, if you didn't know that, Romans and Greeks didn't just make all of their sculptures white. They weren't just in love with colorless statues. Most of their statues were actually pretty brightly colored. They all just washed away, and nobody bothered to keep repainting them. So ancient history was a lot more colorful than it looks like today. Anyway, that's not the point. What is more interesting to me is that, given what we do know about his origins, the Romans didn't care much about them. He had Punic ancestry, meaning his ancestors were of the hated and feared Carthaginian line. He also had Berber blood, meaning that some of his ancestors were the most ancient peoples of Africa. And as far as we can tell, nobody in Rome lost any sleep over it. There were many people who challenged Septimus's legitimacy, but they challenged it because they wanted to be emperor, not because they thought Septimus's bloodline or ancestry disqualified him. Septimus inaugurated a family dynasty that would hold power for quite some time. This was fortunate for the Romans because stability was good. It was unfortunate, though, because his son turned out to be kind of a tyrant. Well, one of his sons turned out to be a tyrant. Maybe the other one was nice, but he got murdered by the tyrannical brother before he could do anything. Power-hungry siblings are a major health risk in the ancient world. This fratricidal filial fluke was named Marcus Aurelius Antonius, but he was better known by his nickname Caracalla. Apparently, he got the nickname because he really liked to wear hooded tunics from Gaul that were called caracallas. He made them so popular that they nicknamed him after the garment he wore. Which means In Simeon's Wake is now brought to you by Men's Fashion. Have you ever wanted to make a statement? Well, why would you do that? Don't make a statement. Smolder. Look at the camera from all different angles while wearing strangely cropped clothes for no reason. Become a model, a template, a tabula rasa, on which men can project their desires to be you and women their desires to be with you. Meanwhile, let the voices in your head run amok. Kill your brother, kill your brother, kill your brother. Your bros will love you if you dress. Tyranny is fun. Men's Fashion. Creating the mask for you to hide behind since 200 AD. When he wasn't busy popularizing various forms of menswear, Caracalla did some other nice things too, like expanding citizenship. It was under his reign that for the first time, all free Roman men were granted the privileges and duties of citizenship. Although they had more rights than ever before, Roman citizens lost one crucial privilege, though: the right to choose their own names. In the declaration that gave everybody this citizenship, Caracalla decreed that everybody had to add Marcus Aurelius to their names. They didn't have to get rid of their old names, to be clear. They just had to add the emperor's first and middle names to their names. So I would become Benjamin Keith Marcus Aurelius Wyatt, or something like that. Now, the whole point of a name is to tell one person apart from another. So if you make everybody have the same two names, you've kind of defeated the purpose. Also, forcing free citizens to take a name that they didn't ask for is kind of self-defeating. It's like giving a man the Woman of the Year award, Parks and Rec style. But Caracalla was not about to be deterred by silly inconveniences like logical incoherence. All men were citizens, and all men were named after him. He was the daddy of the entire empire, just like he probably wanted. Perhaps he insisted on this as a consolation prize for the fact that he had recently married a woman he despised. His father, Emperor Septimus, wanted to establish an alliance with a key noble family. The way you usually made an alliance in those days was by marrying one of your kids to one of the other family's kids and calling it a day. It was all very Game of Thrones-like, but with better lighting and marginally less bloodshed. So Septimus found the family and married his son off at the ripe old age of 14. It didn't matter that Caracalla was still a legal child under Roman law, or that he hated his bride-to-be's guts. There was an alliance to be formed, and by golly, Septimus was gonna form it. That alliance lasted right up until Septimus died, at which point the bride's father was suddenly found guilty of treason, and the bride and her brother were exiled, where they died under mysterious circumstances. I'll give you 3 guesses as to who was likely behind that plot, and the first 2 don't count. Caracalla's bloodthirsty character followed him into adulthood. Once he went into the city of Alexandria and found the citizens had made a play satirizing him. This is the sort of thing that most rulers learn to grin and bear. You are a powerful person, and one of the ways people cope with your power is by making fun of you. Most rulers are fine with this. They have all the power, so who cares if a few people make fun of you? Well, Caracalla cares, apparently. He had a bunch of Alexandria's elites executed right in front of him, then told his troops to spend a few days looting and pillaging the city for good measure. At this point, you can probably see why Caracalla has gotten such a reputation for being a brute. He had a fragile ego and was prone to violence when that ego was threatened. He also did not think about the long-term consequences of his actions. Alexandria was a city of books, which meant it was a city of nerds. Probably felt good to punish the nerds for making fun of him. Maybe his soldiers even gave them wedgies as they plundered their books. However, nerds write more books, and if there is ever a way to make sure that everybody remembers what a jerk you are, it's by upsetting the nerds who write the history books. So most of the elites in the empire breathed a sigh of relief when a disgruntled soldier assassinated Caracalla in 217 at the ripe old age of 29. However, there was one group of folks who had done a bit better under Caracalla's reign. That group was the Christians. His father Severus was responsible for many persecutions against Christians. In fact, it was during his reign that the martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicity supposedly occurred. Now, as far as we know, Severus didn't launch any empire-wide persecutions. However, he did tolerate, and maybe even encourage, persecution of local Christians. Caracalla did not. He didn't like the Christians any more than his dad had, he just didn't really care about them. He had better things to do, like be a fashion icon, and hate his wife's family, and brutally murder anyone who made fun of him. Caracalla's attitude set the tone for Christians during the 3rd century. Roman officials had never really tried to exterminate Christianity. Christians were mostly harmless weirdos who committed victimless crimes. Roman officials got around to stopping Christians if they had the time. And during the 3rd century, for the most part, no one had time. To say that 3rd century Rome was a car crash would be an insult to compactable vehicles everywhere. The 3rd century Roman Empire was a nitroglycerin-fueled monster truck flying off a ramp, doing a 720-degree flip while every alarm system blares, crashing into the bleachers of terrified fans and leveling the underground supports, causing the entire structure to collapse, all while Freebird plays in the background. It was bad. The Roman Empire was beset by enemies from within and without, and most of its emperors had short-lived reigns that were mostly spent trying and failing to keep the empire together. There is actually a 50-year period in this time frame that historians call the Crisis of the 3rd Century, which is never a particularly great name for a time that you have to live through. While this was bad news for the citizenry of Rome, it was good news for Christians, who enjoyed more respite from persecution than they had ever known before. They used this time well, evangelizing and converting more and more of the populace. In 200 AD, the Christians were a negligible portion of the population, maybe a couple of percentage points. By 300 AD, they would be up to 10% of the population. It's time to look at the Christians of Africa. How did these folks, new and old alike, worship, live, and think about the God they were coming to know? Let's start in the West with North Africa. North Africa was dotted with cities of varying sizes, especially on the coast, thanks to the flourishing farming of the inland and the many, many hungry Roman citizens there were to feed. And you could have almost any kind of food you wanted in North Africa. Modern-day Tunisia and Algeria supplied grains and cereals, cattle, fruits, and olive oil came from the drier inland regions, and you could even get fish sauce in the coastal cities. Religious life featured prominently in these towns. There was often a big temple which sat on an artificial hill to remind everyone how important the Roman gods were. Or, for the smaller towns, it would just be on like a nice little mound or something. The crown jewel of the North African coastline was Carthage. That may surprise you, given that Rome rather famously burned Carthage to the ground and salted the earth to prevent it from ever being resettled at the end of the Third Punic War. Now, 300 years later, Carthage was a thriving center of commerce within the Roman Empire. What happened? Well, money happened. The Romans were quick to learn what the Phoenicians had learned before them. Carthage was perfectly situated. It had easy access to trade routes over land and sea, and it was an amazing choke point to control naval engagements in the Mediterranean. The Romans could hate their cunning, deceitful Punic foes as much as they wanted. There was just no replacing Carthage as a city. It had what every good real estate show prizes above all else: location, location, location. In Simeon's Wake is now brought to you by Location. Mark Antony and Cleopatra are looking for a second home to accommodate their burgeoning empire. The realtor Hannibal has finally found the perfect spot for them. Oh wow, this place is great. I love the open floor plan. Yeah, the last owners burned the place down and salted the fields. It's like a canvas waiting for whatever you want to do. Now, what are the schools like? We've been thinking about, starting a family. I won't lie, the school district is not the best. But you've got easy access to great sea lanes, and the charter schools in Italy are very welcoming. Oh, that's great, Mark! Our kid could get a real Latin education. What's the price point? Okay, so it is a little bit over your budget. It's going to cost you 3 wars and rebuilding your navy twice. But the economic gains you get from the trade routes should more than offset the costs. And you haven't seen the best part of the house yet. If you'll follow me, a walk-in closet. Oh, I love it! Yes, and it's fully stocked with trained slaves to help you pick the perfect outfit for the day. That closet is really big. Do the slaves live in there? How did they get there? Yes, actually, their quarters attached to it. There's just one problem. Honey, where are we going to put your clothes? With its ideal location, Carthage and North Africa attracted folks from all over the empire. Older Punic and Greek inhabitants were joined by entrepreneurially minded up-and-comers from modern-day Spain, and many Romans on the Italian mainland came to North Africa as well. There were also colonies set up for veteran soldiers, kind of like a government-sponsored retirement community. With all of these different ethnic groups, North Africa was distinguished not so much by its racial makeup, but by its language. Like the rest of the West, and unlike the eastern half of the empire, Latin was the dominant language in North Africa. There's still a hint of Greek in texts from around the year 200, but that quickly fades away. The language of Rome would be the language of North Africa. Period. Full stop. Now, how many Christians were there in North Africa at the start of the century? It's hard to say. We do know that there were a lot of bishops around, though. By 250 AD, African churches had councils that brought in up to 90 bishops, which means there were well over 100 bishops in total working in North Africa at the time. However, remember that every city in the province had its own bishop, and sometimes each church had its own bishop. So how big were the churches these bishops served? We have no idea. All we can say is that Christians had spread across the breadth of North Africa by 250. How deep their reach went is unknown. As I have mentioned before, the Christian spread led to infrequent persecutions of their number. These persecutions had a particularly deep effect on the church in Africa and in North Africa. To foreshadow a little bit, there is a pattern that plays out several times over the course of the century. The pattern is this. Some emperor or local official gets a bee in his proverbial bonnet and orders a persecution of Christians. Under this persecution, some Christians remain faithful to the gospel, and others defect. Sometimes they even betray other members of the church and gave their name to the Roman authorities. After the persecution was done, there's a division in the church. Some members want to allow the traitors back to church after they do penance. Others insist that there is no restitution possible, that the traitors must be shunned and their memory damned. The church would struggle within itself to find the right balance of justice, mercy, and safety in relation to those who had avoided martyrdom. It also struggled with some of those who had embraced martyrdom, specifically those who were members of heretical or schismatic groups. Now, we haven't talked a ton about heresy and schism yet, and this episode is going to be long enough already, so I'm going to be brief here. To make a long story short, from the beginning, the church was worried about folks claiming they were part of the church, but who really weren't. Kind of like indie kids who don't want the preps to be into the same bands that they are, except it's about church and not music and concerns the fate of your eternal soul. Sometimes these copycat Christians change the doctrines of the church while claiming to still be Christians. The so-called Gnostic groups are good examples of this. Valentinians and Sethians certainly claimed to be Christians, but other groups were not so sure. They had never heard of an aeon, and they thought that these groups were retconning the gospel in some really problematic ways. And this concern goes all the way back to the Bible itself. The letters of John, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Titus are all really concerned to make sure that churches test the wandering teachers who come to them. You've got to make sure that they're teaching the same doctrines as the rest of the church. The idea that someone might have corrupted the teachings of Christ was a common one, and an ever-present danger for early Christians. So that's heresy for you. Then there are the other kinds of copycat Christians, the schismatics. They get their name from the word schism, which refers to a rupture or break. Schismatics often don't teach different doctrine from the regular church, but they reject the structures of authority that have been set up. For example, let's say that you think your bishop is doing a bad job. You have several options. First, you can tell the bishop and hope they shape up. Second, you can complain to someone else, maybe another bishop, so that they can investigate and discipline if appropriate. Or you can say that that bad bishop is no longer a bishop, that you are the bishop now, and you are going to set up your own church where that bishop has no authority and where you get to do your own thing. That last option is the schismatic one. You essentially ignore authority that you don't like and set up your own church. Bishops, of course, did not like this. Nor did many other Christians. After all, if you only respect the authorities you agree with, then really you are the only authority that counts. The church had processes for disciplining bad leaders. To ignore those processes and just declare yourself the final authority was seen as not great. Now, of course, you might say, well, but what do we do if we've gone through the disciplinary process and still nobody does anything about the bad bishops? Which is a great question, and one we're going to be covering a lot in future episodes. For now, just know there were some African Christians who felt like their leaders had lost their moral authority because of how they behaved during a persecution. So that's the schismatics. Heretics and schismatics were seen as really no longer part of the church, and as if having departed from the true faith, which meant it was much to the church's embarrassment when members of heretical and schismatic groups were martyred right alongside everybody else during persecutions. The Roman officials didn't care about internecine strife within the church. As far as they were concerned, they were all Christians and all guilty, and thus all needed their heads removed from their necks. And there were plenty of heretical and schismatic Christians who were sincere enough in their faith to die for it. That really got the church's goose. It is an uncomfortable thing to realize that your ideological opponents are no less sincerely committed than you are. But that appears to have been the case. Oftentimes, churches did not list the names of all the people martyred in a persecution, probably because some of those people were affiliated with groups they thought heretical or schismatic, which only made the church's struggle with persecution more complex. But despite the church's struggles within and without, more and more of the empire's citizens were joining its number. To do so was not easy. For starters, there was a long period of preparation and instruction before you could be baptized. This period was called the catechumenate. During the catechumenate, you would meet for instruction with your bishop or pastor or other appointed teacher. You would attend church services, although you would be dismissed before they celebrated communion. And communion, or the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, or whatever you want to call it, happened every week. Even though you only got half the church, you were not considered half a Christian when you were a catechumen. Many people spent most of their lives in the catechumenate, and catechumens were expected to live up to all the standards of the faith. That meant no idol worship, and none of those silly immoral behaviors that non-Christians were allowed to get up to. If you wanted to keep your hobby of being an axe murderer on the weekends, the catechumenate was not the place for you. It was also not the place for you if you wanted to keep axes away from your neck. Catechumens can and were martyred for the faith. After all, Perpetua and Felicity were catechumens when they were imprisoned. Andrew McGowan, a scholar of ancient Christianity and my former teacher, has said before that baptism was not so much the process of becoming a Christian as a move from one level of commitment to another. When you were a catechumen, you were a Christian, full stop. Baptism was a step up on the ladder, not a foot in the door. Now, if you've been paying attention so far, you've probably figured out that that means the catechumenate ended when you were baptized. We know a fair bit about how baptism happened from a guy named Tertullian of Carthage, a brilliant orator, theologian, and curmudgeon, who wrote about the practice at length. We'll meet him in his own right very soon, but not quite yet. For now, just know that he is a certified big deal in the early church and has a lot to say about a lot of different things. From Tertullian, we learn that the early African church shared a lot in common with 1990s kids' snacks. They really liked dunking. Like Dunkaroos, or those little Lunchables meals with dipping sauces, the African Church of 200 was all about immersive experiences. Not for them, those little baptismal fonts where you just scoop up some water and pour it over the person's head. No. The biggest churches had fonts the size of a small pool, where you could walk down into the pool yourself and were dunked right there in the middle of the building. Smaller churches might have used a nearby river, but the point was dunking was the order of the day. Nor was one dunk enough for them. Like everything else, baptism comes in threes. So candidates were dunked 3 times. One for the Father, one for the Son, and one for the Holy Spirit. Before being dunked, they also said a confession of faith, where they professed their belief in the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and the Church. Those first 3 are pretty standard, of course. In fact, they are biblically mandated. Jesus tells his disciples to baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit in Matthew chapter 28, verse 19. Tertullian is aware of the difference. He's aware that Jesus didn't say you had to baptize in the name of the church, and basically says that yes, we did add the church in there, and it's a bit more ample than what Jesus told us to do, but there's no harm in going a bit overboard, right? I mean, it's the church. Jesus likes church, right? Then, after the dunking, the candidates get the drip. Specifically, the drip of oil on their foreheads as they are anointed. This anointing symbolizes the priesthood of all believers that they share in, and was a common way of blessing people since the days of the Old Testament. The drip was a crucial part of the baptismal process, so crucial that in order to keep it, candidates also got the stank. Specifically, the stench of not bathing for a week. This was really uncommon. At this time, ancient Romans were getting bathed daily, just like we do today. Ancient Roman Christians would not bathe for a week after they were baptized, which is a pretty bold thing for a persecuted minority to do, because if they didn't know you were a Christian by your love, they might be able to figure it out by your smell. The culmination of the baptismal ritual was what happened right after it, though. For once you were baptized, you were able to partake of the church's most sacred meal, the Eucharist. Now, Tertullian doesn't talk about the Eucharist a ton, but he gives us some information about the order of worship. When the church gathered, it prayed for the world, read from the Bible, had some kind of a sermon that was based on whatever bit of the Bible they'd read, and then shared bread and wine. Then he describes a meal in the evening that he refers to as a love feast or as the Lord's Supper. Participants at the meal were drawn from all social classes, and particular honor was given to the poor. The evening worship included prayers, but also included a full meal. Morning worship did not include a full sit-down meal and tended to be bigger than the evening celebrations. Now, funny enough, Tertullian considered the evening service to be the primary one. That was the one instituted by Christ when he had the Last Supper with his disciples. The morning service was nice and all, but it was an addition to what God had commanded. Of course, the Bible does talk a lot about praising God in the morning. For example, Psalm 143 verse 8 says, "Let me hear of your steadfast love in the morning." So how Tertullian gets around that and says morning worship is optional, I don't know. I'm guessing he was just more of a night owl and wanted to find that in the Bible. The Christians of Tertullian's day also engaged in one of the timeless pastimes of the church everywhere, arguing about how Christ was present in the bread and wine. Tertullian's view on the matter is interesting because he argues that Christ is present in the bread and wine in the exact same way that he was present in his earthly body, which makes you think that he's going to be all hyper-realist. But then he says that the bread and wine are figures or symbols of the body of Christ. I suspect that what he is trying to say is something like this. The bread and the wine are not Christ himself, any more than the flesh of Jesus of Nazareth is the whole of him. But Jesus has taken the bread and wine to himself, just as he has taken his body to himself, and that makes it holy. So when you get the bread and wine, you get Jesus, full stop. As is often the case in sacramental debates, it's more helpful to look at how people treat the bread and wine than it is to ask them what they think about the bread and wine. Tertullian mentions that when any of the bread or wine falls to the ground, Christians get really sad. They don't want it on the ground. It's the Lord's body. It should be honored. Furthermore, Christians would take the bread home to eat it later in the day. All of which implies a pretty high view of Christ's presence in the sacrament. Jesus remains in the bread even after the service is completed, and the bread is treated with the same reverence that Christ's body would be treated with. Now, worship could be held on any day of the week. There was, of course, a preference for worship on Sundays, but that could be tricky. Why? Well, because the weekend hadn't been invented yet. Romans didn't hold Sundays sacred, and they had a whole empire to run, and thus had little patience for giving people the day off. Depending on their social status, believers might have to work on Sunday. Maybe they could get to a Sunday evening service, or maybe it was another day during the week. And we have evidence of households praying together throughout the week, which offered other opportunities to gather. Now, where there is worship and communion, there is also excommunication. We know that Christians who had committed grave sins were excluded from the Eucharistic celebration. Now, what counts as a grave sin? Well, that's a good question. It depends. In practice, it was whatever your local authority decided counted as a grave sin. There were some easy cases, of course. If you murdered someone, that definitely counted as a grave sin. If you gossiped about your neighbor, that was probably not. Trickier were the cases in between. And as you might guess, a lot of times this had to do with how you had acted during a persecution. In later church councils, including the Council of Nicaea, we can see bishops trying to figure out what is appropriate penance for various kinds of people who gave in to torment. For example, if you gave up the names of other Christians after being tortured, you would get one penance. If you gave up their names before you ever got tortured, you got a harsher penance. Again, this comes back to the perennial problem of balancing the health of the community and its integrity with Christ's command to show mercy and forgive. Well, if Tertullian had his way, there wouldn't have been much mercy. Tertullian is a grumpy old man. When you read him, it's clear that he probably yelled at clouds for fun every now and then. And Tertullian thought some sins permanently excluded you from the church. If you committed adultery, that was it. No Eucharist for you, not now, not ever. Ditto for murder, which is a little bit more understandable to me. I mean, if you slip up once, you could slip up again, and we would prefer not to have the flock murdered. Still, that's pretty extreme. Isn't Tertullian basically saying that if you commit adultery or murder, you're doomed to hellfire? Is there no hope for you? Well, no, actually. Some folks will argue about this, but it's fairly clear that Tertullian doesn't think you need to be a member of the visible church to be saved. He definitely does not think that infants have to be baptized to be saved. And he has this fascinating line where he talks about how some people who haven't found peace in the church will go to the prisons to visit soon-to-be martyrs and talk with them. That is their devotion. They don't go to church for whatever reason, but they talk to the martyrs. In other words, just because we don't see you in church doesn't mean we won't see you in heaven. It's a strikingly gentle stance to take, especially for someone with as dour a reputation as Tertullian. Tertullian gives us a whole lot of information about how the church looked in North Africa, and a lot of what he says is true, more or less, for other churches in the region, but there is a lot more going on in Africa than just that Latin Western province. Egypt continued to rise as a key province in the Roman Empire and in the history of Christianity. One of the signs of this is the rise of the importance of the Bishop of Alexandria. For it's in the 200s AD that we first see Alexandrian bishops appear in the historical record. Now, that doesn't mean there were no bishops beforehand, mind you. The church keeps long lists of all the bishops after St. Mark. However, those bishops have made very little impact in the pages of history. That is not terribly surprising. There weren't all that many Christians in general, and the Egyptian church was probably a network of house churches. Those house churches would have followed different local teachers who may or may not have reported to the same bishop. Furthermore, Alexandria's influence and importance really grew starting in the year 200. Alexandria had always been an important place for nerds to go and talk about nerdy stuff. But it became more of an economic powerhouse at this point, which then meant more prominence for all its citizens, including the Christians. So it is that the first holy overseer to really make it into our story is a fellow by the name of Demetrius. Demetrius is an interesting guy. He was not a career cleric, he was a farmer. Farming is never the most glamorous trade, but if you have to be a farmer, Alexandria, and really Egypt in general, is a pretty good place to do it. You're close to the Nile River, and the Nile River floods in a very predictable way every year, and after it floods, it leaves behind super rich nutrients in the soil that lead to awesome crop yields. So Demetrius was one of those felicitous farmhands who fed the flocks from the fertile farmland of his fatherland. He was also pious. He and his wife lived together as celibates, which was not the norm, but some Christians of the time engaged in the practice, even though St. Paul discourages it in 1 Corinthians. Anyway, all this might lead one to ask, how does a celibate farmer become a bishop? Answer: through visions. The story goes that the previous bishop, a fellow named Julius, was not doing so hot. He had a sense that he would die, and he was positively befuddled about how to choose the next bishop. So he conveniently had a mystical vision to tell him how to choose it. The vision said that the next day someone would visit him bearing grapes, which was interesting because grapes were not in season at the time. Now, oftentimes these visions, these dreams, were deeply symbolic. Could the grapes symbolize the wine of the Eucharist? Could this person be bearing fruit out of season to signify his virtuous life? That he was a tree who bore good fruit in all times, even in droughts, just like Jeremiah 17:8 says. Could this be deeply symbolic? No. The next day, Demetrius had a shipment to drop off for the old bishop and happened to bring him a handful of grapes in exchange for a blessing. No deep symbolism, just a vision about a man who brings some fruit. The bishop saw it and was like, "You're the one!" and announced him as the next bishop of Alexandria, which must have been a pretty big shock to old Demetrius. But he took up the post nonetheless. Demetrius was mostly an administrator. He is remembered for doing things like standardizing calendars so that everybody celebrated the same holidays on the same days and things like that. Not exactly earth-shattering stuff, but it is the kind of faithful administrative work that keeps the church running. Demetrius was also known for being on the wrong side of a dispute with a once-in-a-millennium genius. That genius was a man named Origen of Alexandria, whom we are going to be spending a lot of time with in a few months, so I don't really want to spend too much time covering him here. Suffice it for now to say that Origen was really, really smart and really, really charismatic. He was also not a part of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. For most of his life, Origen was a lay academic. Demetrius recognized his brilliance and appointed him to be the head of the catechetical school of Alexandria. What is the catechetical school, you ask? Well, good question. It is a school for catechumens. That's really about all we know. The Alexandrian catechumenate was pretty well formalized, and so they had like an actual school with a formalized curriculum and formal teachers. We don't really know much about how it operated or how big it was, because remember, early Christian schools aren't like modern universities. They didn't have their own buildings or administration or discus-throwing teams, complete with student pep clubs to yell insulting chants at the other school's discus-throwing team. Oftentimes, these schools met in somebody's house, with a small group of learners who studied at the feet of the master. We don't know how big the school was when Origen took over, but we do know that it grew a lot under him. He taught his first batch of students so well that many of them became teachers in turn. He then stopped teaching the elementary courses and had that first generation of students become the new teachers, while he focused on the higher level courses. It was a very good thing he could delegate because Origen's star was rising. Origen's prodigious intellect was noticed very quickly throughout the empire. He started getting invitations to preach and teach from Christians living in Palestine, and he took them up on the offer. And he was a really good preacher. We have records of his preaching where he would stand up and ask the bishop, hey, which of these 3 to 4 passages we've read would you like me to preach on? The bishop would pick one on the spot, and Origen would make up his sermon. Right there, impromptu, speaking for over an hour, while scribes furiously dictated every word he said. Many of his sermons are still considered masterpieces of scriptural interpretation. Now that was remarkable in and of itself. What's even more remarkable was that Origen did all of this as a lay person. Traditionally, it is the prerogative of the highest-ranking clergy person to preach at a service. That's usually the bishop, and if the bishop isn't around, a priest will do it. But here was Origen, preaching brilliantly while his fathers in God listened with rapt attention to his marvelous musings. Over time, Origen thought he might be called to be ordained. Which makes sense. I mean, if you're going to be asked to be in church all the time anyway, and you're already preaching, that's like half the job right there. So he asked if Demetrius would ordain him. Demetrius said no. We don't know why Demetrius said no, but he did. However, the next time Origen went on one of his speaking tours, some of the bishops in Palestine decided to just go ahead and ordain him, on the spot, which they did. Demetrius found out and was absolutely furious. He was furious for several reasons. The first and most obvious one is that his authority had been flouted. He had refused to ordain Origen, and instead of accepting it, Origen had just gotten ordained by another bishop. Bishops are not like doctors. If you don't like what your bishop has to say, you're not allowed to run off and get a second opinion from another bishop. Furthermore, Demetrius probably did not like the fact that Origen's star was rising so much. Demetrius was trying to organize and standardize the church's practices. That required him to expand his influence. But it is hard to win friends and influence people when there is a once-in-a-millennium superstar in your church who is a better preacher than you, a better thinker than you, and maybe even a better person than you. So Demetrius wrote an angry letter to the bishops of Palestine, telling them that they had done a very bad thing indeed, and that they should return his school teacher to him. The bishops wrote back to Demetrius, politely telling him to shove off. Or, I guess, as politely as you can tell someone to shove off. You know, it's kind of not a polite thing to say. As you might imagine, the vibes between Origen and Demetrius quickly became rancid. Origen finally decided to pack up shop and leave Alexandria entirely for Palestine, where his talent and scholarship was much more appreciated. Now, all of this tells us something very important about the world of Egyptian Christianity. All across the empire, bishops were centralizing their power, but at a relatively slow rate. Bishops wanted everyone to know that they were the boss and everybody had to answer to them. But being a bishop could mean very different things over the course of ancient Christianity. In the beginning, when you were part of a house church with 10 members, being a bishop might have just meant setting up the chairs for worship and reminding everybody who did what that day. Later, being a bishop might have meant being the senior pastor of the one church that was in your town. By the 200s, it started to mean being a senior official who oversaw multiple churches in your territory. Interestingly enough, the territory you controlled had to do with the political power of your city. Alexandria had always been a big deal, but by the 200s AD, it was a really big deal. For whatever reason, however, bishops in Egypt had more trouble consolidating their power than others. Demetrius tried to flex his muscles, but it didn't go as well for him as it did for his peers. His successors would face the same challenge, and the Bishop of Alexandria's difficulty getting priests to cooperate would be one of the proximate causes of the Nicene Creed. However, if the Alexandrian Church was a bit less centralized than some of its peers, there is a place in Africa where Christianity was even more nascent: Ethiopia. You'll notice we haven't had all that much to say about Ethiopia on the podcast thus far. That is not because I have lost interest in it. I'm really interested in telling you all about it. However, unfortunately, there is not much to tell at this stage. Simeon Bakos went to Ethiopia to preach the gospel. Presumably he had some success, but the church remained small and produced no written records until the king of Axum adopted Christianity as the state religion. But that happens in the early 300s, and we are still in the 200s, which means we must tragically cool our jets for a bit longer. Now, you should know that this pattern of the apostles going somewhere and founding a church that remains small for a few centuries is a fairly common one. Take, for example, the Armenian Apostolic Church. This is the national church of the country of Armenia, and they trace their lineage all the way back to the apostles Bartholomew and Thaddeus. However, the church didn't really become a thing until a fellow named Gregory the Illuminator came to town in the late 200s AD. He wanted to preach the gospel to the rest of Armenia and was promptly thrown in a prison cell for 13 years for his trouble. Apparently, so was his wife. The Armenians had 2 prison cells right next to each other and just threw one in each, his and hers style. And they are not nice places. I've been to St. Gregory's prison. It is called the Pit, and Yeah, that's what it is. It's this dank little cell with stone floors and no light, except through a tiny air hole that people would use to throw bread down so that he could survive. Anyway, after 13 years, he was released and persuaded the king to adopt Christianity in 301, and that's when the church really took off in Armenia, at least in terms of numbers. Now, this is not a podcast about Armenian Christianity, but I use that as an example of a larger point. Just because the church didn't leave any historical records for a while doesn't mean it wasn't there. It was small, faithfully meeting and praying, but without the kind of numbers and influence it takes to create documents that will survive for 2 millennia. Just so, in the year 200, the Ethiopian church is there, and may have had a relationship with the Bishop of Alexandria. But the Ethiopian church is going to be making its way onto the scene in about a century or so. For now, our focus remains northward. You have learned about the world of the 3rd century church. Now it's time to focus on their thinkers and texts. For this period of history produced some of the greatest names in the ancient world. It's time to get to know them and the waves they made. Waves whose influences extend even beyond Simeon's wake. Thank you for listening to In Simeon's Wake, part of the Earth and Altar Podcast Network. If you liked the episode, please leave it a review and drop a like on that episode at your earliest convenience, or even before. It's nice. If you'd like to support this work, head on over to patreon.com/Ben Wyatt. That's patreon.com/Ben Wyatt, WYATT. Until next time, stay curious.